right, so as always, let's take a few moments to review everything we learned in this section of the course. So in this section, we began building out our taco cards, and we began by styling just one initial taco card, and then we copied and pasted the JSX elements to render 3 taco cards on the screen. So we saw the duplication in both our editor and in the browser, and a separate taco card component almost revealed itself to us. And that is a very common thing to happen in React. Many times you're just going to start building the user interface, and the pieces that are duplicated will reveal themselves to you over time. So we saw the commonalities in each taco card. For example, they all had a white background, a specified width, they had the add to order button at the bottom, but they also had differences between them, such as the taco title and the taco picture. So we wanted a solution that would allow us to keep the things that were constant, but also customize the things that varied. And the solution to that was props. So a prop is a piece of data that a parent component passes down to a child. The syntax is very similar to how we use attributes in HTML. So when we render a child component, we provide the prop name, then an equal sign, and then the value we want to pass down. If our value is something like a string, we can simply provide the string inline. But if we have something more complex like a number or an array or an object, those are JavaScript constructs, which means we need to use the curly braces when we are passing that prop down to the child. As far as the child component, it's going to receive the props as the first parameter to the function that we define, the component function that returns the JSX. So for example, if the parent provides 10 props, then we will receive a props object with 10 properties, and then we can access the props and use them in the child component. We can destructure the properties, we can destructure the properties in the parameter list, or we can simply provide the props prefix when we reference the properties in line. All of those are valid solutions as long as you understand the idea that we are getting a single object of all those props. Then you understand the basic idea behind this piece of React. We also talked about prop types. The prop types library performs type validation for component props at runtime, which means when the app runs in the browser rather than within your editor. The way this works is we add a prop types property to our functional component, and we assign that to a JavaScript object where the prop names are the properties and the values are the types from the prop types library. So you may recall we had things like prop types.string or prop types.number, and there's other types in there for things like arrays, functions, and objects. You can actually get pretty granular, and we'll go more in depth with that library a little bit later in the course. But the idea is your browser can then check, hey, this component expects prop A, and it expects it to be of type number, and it will validate that whenever your application runs. We also learned that we can mandate that a prop be required by adding that .required property at the end. And then your browser console will similarly warn you, hey, you told me prop A should be present, but the parent component did not give me prop A. Something has gone wrong. And you can then debug your code. Of course, in our example, we had a single parent and a single child, so the benefit may not have been as clear. But in the real world, it's typical to have a component hierarchy of several levels down, right? So a parent might pass props down to a child, which passes it down to its own child, and so on for 10 more levels. And sometimes you might forget to write a prop name or forget to pass a value down like that. Sometimes you might be working with very complex prop values like arrays of objects where each object has 10 properties. And you can get really specific with prop types in declaring that exact type so that prop types can perform that validation and tell you that something is off or there is a mismatch somewhere in your data structures and their expected types. We also learned about default props, which allow us to specify a fallback value for a prop. So in other words, if the parent component does not give the child component a value for a prop, the child component can rely on this default value, this fallback value, just in case. The way that syntax works is we assign a default props property to the functional component. We similarly assign it a JavaScript object where the properties are the prop names and the values are the fallback values to utilize. And we saw how when we forgot, for example, to provide a taco name from the parent, we had a fallback value rendered just fine in the browser. So it's important for us to decide which props are critical and which ones are nice to have. Typically, if a prop is required from a parent, we're indicating that the child needs it to work. So in our case, if we are an e-commerce site selling people tacos, obviously the person should know the taco's name before they place it into the cart. So that is probably a prop that we want to utilize. At the same time, in the real world, if we forget to provide an image, is that the end of the world? I would say not necessarily, but obviously it depends on the specific project and need. It's not a React issue, it's a product and business issue. But now you understand how you can mandate that something is required, or alternatively, if it is optional, you can choose whether you want to provide a default value to utilize if the parent does not provide that prop. Finally, we close this section off by installing the React Developer Tools extension for Chrome. It is also available for other web browsers like Firefox and Edge. And the extension allows you to analyze and debug your React application in the browser. As we saw when we accessed the Components tab in our developer tools, we can see the complete component hierarchy. So we can see all the parent components and the children that they render, and all the way down the entire hierarchy or tree. And we can also do things like edit individual component props to see the immediate impact in our user interface. And this can be super helpful when debugging because we do not need to bounce back between our editor and the browser to see that hot module reloading. We can simply edit props in line and see if everything looks as it should. And as soon as you refresh the application, all of those prop values go back to their default. So none of that work is permanent. It's just this experimental playground where we can play around. And that makes it obviously super helpful when debugging and looking at your application and its state. There's also other React features that we have not talked about yet, but as we get familiar with them, you'll notice they also appear in the React DevTools. So in general, it gives you a good high-level overview of not just your entire application, but all the individual components that make it up and their individual state and props and things like that. So familiarize yourself with that over time and take a look at it as we introduce additional React features throughout the course. All right, so that's all there's to cover in this section, and lots more fun lies up ahead. So I will see you in the next lesson.